David had many external reasons to be afraid. Yet, he said, I will not be afraid. There is something about it. Real peace is not defined by the circumstances on the outside. No. If you wait for circumstances to get bad before you start building your confidence in God, you'll be starting too late. The way to start. You're welcome to another episode of Logos, where our hearts are transformed by the revelation of Christ. This is a walk through the Psalms, episode 13. In the last episode, we looked at the first section of Psalm 3 from verse 1 to 4. And we're going to conclude Psalm 3 today, looking at the second section from verse 5 to 8. Let's read from verse 5. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. Now, we have said in the last episode that the setting of this psalm is about the persecution and the attempt on the life of David, the king. He was under threat by his son named Absalom, who took over the kingdom by force. And at this point in time, when this psalm was reading, David was on the run for his life. He was like a fugitive who was being mocked, and it appeared that God was no longer with him because, among human beings, one of the ways they erroneously judge the presence of God in a man's life is to see whether things are going on well with the person or not. So people mocked him, and he was facing serious persecution and threat to his life. So in the midst of all that, David, while he's still away as a fugitive, he wrote these psalms. Now, one thing I want you to see as we go on in this discussion in this episode is that you should realize that David is not just writing an empty poem. He was literally putting down what he was going through. So this is not reading in retrospect. It was in the midst of this life-threatening situation that David wrote this particular psalm. I'm talking about Psalm 3. So let's start to discuss it from verse 5. It says, I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. If you remember the setting of this psalm, you will not but be astonished, because this is a life-threatening situation. In a situation of coup d'etat, when people forcefully take over the kingdom, they know that as long as that person they displace, the king or the ruler they displace is still alive, is still a threat, even though he doesn't have an army around him. So David is well aware. We're going to see that as we read downwards towards the end of this section. But you will see that David is well aware of the threat. He was well aware of the danger he is still in, because now he doesn't have the army around himself. He doesn't have the weapons of war that is available to the entire nation that he used to have. So you understand the threat that is around him. His life is in danger. Many people have risen against him. Like he said in verse 6, they have increased the number. His life is in danger. And so, for such a man who is going through such a life-threatening situation, it is almost impossible to think that that man can have a restful sleep. And that's quite interesting here. We need to pause and have a reflection about what our lives have been in the past few months or in the past few years. Now, look at what David said again. I lay down and slept. I know that normally people's experience is such that when they are passing through difficult situations, prolonged challenges, or life-threatening situations, they are so worried, the blood pressure begins to skyrocket, their health begin to deteriorate, and not only that, they are unable to sleep. Even when they try to sleep, they can't maintain a long duration of sleep because the mind is bothered. But AI is a man who is facing a very terrible situation. Talk about mockery, talk about life threatening situation, talk about being stripped of power and honor and the glory of a king. David is in that situation at this point in time. So who else should stay awake in worry and anxiety, if not someone like David in this situation? Yet he said, I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. One of the things that we can learn from David's experience and what is said in verse 5 is the fact that what determines whether your heart will be settled or it will be full of worry is not necessarily the external circumstance. With the wars and rumors of wars, with the shout and the noise that is going on around the world, we see a great thing to learn from David in this situation. That means that external influence is not necessarily what determines whether the heart will be in peace or will be troubled. There is a higher force, there is a higher influence that keeps a man. Now, David, at this point in time that he's talking about having restful sleep, is not in a guarded palace. He doesn't have the nation's army around him to protect him. His life is still in danger at this point. He was still on the run, yet he slept good. So it reminds us that it's possible for a man to be in the midst of turmoil, in the midst of life-threatening situation, and that man will still be at peace. So, we can literally, looking at it from the final perspective, say that the reason I'm unsettled and worried is because of what I'm going through. But that should not be the case for the believer in Christ. No. Because what determines the course of our lives and what goes on in our hearts is much more than the external circumstances. And that's why we must always remember that Christianity is a life that is lived from inside out. So it is possible to be in perfect peace in spite of the external circumstances. So real peace is not defined by the circumstances on the outside. No. Because you must realize that it's possible for a man to be in a serene environment, void of threat and risk, and yet that man is still troubled in his heart. So it's not just about what is going on outside there. It's about the fact that where is your heart? Where is your focus when these things are going on? David is teaching us something very important that we need to pause and think about. So I can be in the midst of life-threatening situation and still sleep good. That's an expression of faith. That's an expression of trust in God. Because eventually, David is showing us that it is possible for a man to be in turmoil, for a man to be in challenge, and still be at rest. Because at the end of the day, he's showing us that protection does not come from weapons of war. True protection is not about how much physical protection and people you have around you. No. True protection, when it comes to the real deal of this whole thing, is of the Lord. It is God that sustains. It is God that protects. Now, let's look at verse 6. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people. Like I said when we started this episode, David is not just writing poems. He's not just writing empty poems here. He is literally recounting what is happening. And if you check the story of Absalom very well, Absalom eventually was bringing more and more people around him. And so the opposition and the number of enemies that were after the life of David were increasing. So David is writing about an actual physical experience, and it was not a fabrication from the top of his head. It was literally writing the things that were happening at that time. He was on the run. And so he made a confession. He said, I will not be afraid. Now, this is quite important too. We must pay attention to the fact that he had all the reasons to be afraid. And so, the life of faith that we are learning from David is telling us that it is possible for me to live without fear, even though external circumstances is suggesting otherwise. And so the life of faith that we learn from the patriarchs of faith and which Jesus bequeathed to us through the apostles is telling us that our lives, the cause of our lives and what is going on in our minds and hearts does not have to be determined by the external circumstances. Even though there were many reasons to be afraid, David said, I will not fear. So you and I can actually get to that point. There is one point I'm going to make before we close this episode about how do I get to this point where things are going about around me and I still choose to be calm without fear. Now, I'm not talking about just making empty confession. I'm saying a situation of perfect peace. Just like the Bible says in Isaiah 26 verse 3, that you will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. I'm going to talk more about that before we close. But look at it again. He said, I will not be afraid of 10,000 of people. What can you do with 10,000 people all by yourself? You are on the run, no protection. Yes, but he said, I will not be afraid. He said, who have set themselves against me all around. That is the characteristics of his enemy. Now look at that word set. That word set suggests a strategic move to destroy him. So it was intentional, it was organized, and it was coordinated. So it's not just some random thing. They were after his life. And these people have set themselves up. And there are so many. We can continue to talk about this, and you continue to see again and again that David had many external reasons to be afraid. Yet, he said, I will not be afraid. There is something about it. The truth is that if you're waiting for the days of challenges to be able to confess this, now you will be studying too late. And that's one of the things I said I'm going to say before we close this episode. But let's go on. Verse 7 says, Arise, O Lord. Let me remind you once again from this verse that God still answers prayer. God still answers prayer when it is difficult to go on. When you look around you and there's no way to turn. I want to remind you once again that it is still God that answers prayer. There is no help in any man. There is no help in any man. True help comes from God only. Of course, by helping you, He will send men to you to help you. No doubt. But ultimately, God is the source of our help and strength. When the things are good, when the situation is fine, God is our help. When all hope is lost physically, God still remains our help. No matter how bad the situation is, we will never get to a point where we will need to turn to men or other source of help apart from God. God is our help. This man is on the run. Now you want to ask that where was God when this man's life was threatened? He's actually accepted before God. He was called a man after God's heart. Yet his own son sent him on the run. And it's possible to gripe and complain and feel, God, when you saw them planning all this evil against me, why didn't you stop them in the first place? And so he could build up an excuse and say, well, God that was saw them when they were chasing me, why should I still call upon him? So in the midst of that situation, David said, Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. Even when you have misgivings against God, you better come out of it on time because God is still the source of help you need. Nothing more than that. You need God at all times. When the situation is fine, you need God. When it is bad, you need God. In all situations, you need God, my friend. And so you must never allow a wrong opinion make you turn your back against God. In all situations, you must always seek God because you need Him. And he said, For you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. Don't forget that all these things that David is saying, he had not got the victory. He was still on the run. He was still hiding from the threat on his life. Look at it. For you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth. So this is suggestive of humiliation of the enemy and eventual victory over them. How can someone be this confident? Nothing physical is giving you hope. If there is anything around you, it is hopelessness. It is death that is actually smelling around him and all over him. And he's so confident, so much that the God that did not intervene on time, he was still speaking to that God and making confession of victory. Look at verse 8. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. Now, one important thing I want to mention as we get to this last verse is the fact that you will notice that David did not change his confession about his confidence in God. He maintained that trust even when he was on the run, even when it appears that he's not going to live to see the next minute. He still maintained that confidence in God. And so, one important thing you must realize is that in every situation, you must learn to seek the Lord in prayer. Not only that, no matter what you are going through, no matter how bad it is, you must learn not to keep your mouth shut. Bible says, let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed. You must learn to affirm and reaffirm with your words, not just thinking about it. You must meditate on it, no doubt, but beyond just thinking about it, your mouth must not be shut. You must affirm your confidence and your trust in the Lord. That is how to fight battles of life. You want to walk in peace, you want to walk in the rest of mind, that which you know of God. Even when it's not readily obvious, you must never shrink back from it. You must never shy away from it. The Lord is my strength. You have a long standing health condition, and it appears it has actually become a chronic issue and there is no solution for it. In the midst of that, even when they have given you the final report that, well, this is the final report, there is no solution to this, you must still maintain that God is my healer. That is exactly a good example we can draw from David's experience here. Look at it. It says salvation belongs to the Lord. At this point in time, he has not been saved from the challenge he was going through. Yet he affirmed the integrity of God, the ability of God to save, and he affirmed his confidence in God. You must always affirm your confidence in God, no matter what the situation is. I've given an example about health condition. It could be lack, it could be issues about family. You must always affirm the goodness of God, even when it appears that situation is getting bad or it's getting worse. All right, and he said, "Your blessings upon your people." Now, let me conclude on this. How can I get to a point where my confidence in God that I do not see remain unshaken, even when it appears that my life is under threat and I'm not going to live long? Situation is threatening my life, and I feel things are getting worse, and it appears God is not there. Now, let me say this again, that if you wait for circumstances to get bad before you start building your confidence in God, you'll be starting too late. The way to start is to create a consistent lifestyle of focusing on God. Now, one thing you will notice about David's experience in this psalm is that it did not shift his gaze from God. It did not shift his focus from God, even when the situation was really bad. And uh, so Isaiah 26 verse 3 once again says that you will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you. So the secret to this kind of lifestyle of peace in the midst of challenges, lifestyle of rest of mind without being aggravated even when the situation is bad. If you want to walk in this kind of lifestyle, the first thing and the most important thing you must remember is that your focus must always be on God alone. Your focus must always remain on God alone. And so it requires that you train your mind in the days before the battle appears, before the things get worse. I know that it's possible you have some few challenges here and there. In the midst of all of that, you should not take that as an excuse to stop you from seeking the Lord with all your heart. And so consistency is the key here. I consistently maintain a lifestyle of seeking the Lord. So prayer is an everyday thing, not just an everyday thing, it's a continuous thing. Studying the Bible is a constant and consistent thing in my life. That is how the mind is trained to focus on God. So, because the mind has a very great tendency to do its own thing. The mind of man has an inclination to just turn on its own way and just turn against God. And that is why the mind of man, our minds, need to be trained in the way of the Lord by a daily commitment to the Lord. Now, how do I know this applies to David? If you look at his history, he's a man who has, over the years, even ever before he became the king, he had actually built a life of communion and intimacy with God. He was indeed intimate with God. So even when challenges came, bigger than what he had faced, Goliath, he was still able to affirm what the Lord had done with him in secret. The story of victories he had before he eventually faced Goliath. And so I'm saying to you that you don't just want to let your life be run by the wind of challenges. No, that is not how God has designed the Christian life. The way God has designed the Christian life is so that our lives are lived from inside out by our conviction in the ability of God. And what builds conviction in the ability of God is not just by mere confession, it's not just by empty confession, it's about building a lifestyle of intimacy with Him. So that when the winds blow and it appears that everything is going to fall apart, you are still able to maintain that focus on God without being distracted. Okay, so we learn from David that we should learn to build that confidence, that consciousness of God that makes us stand firm without fear in the midst of challenges. I will continue from the book of Psalm 4 in the next episode, and until that time, I commend you to God and the word of His grace, which is able to build you up and grant you inheritance among them that are sanctified. Amen.